Well, next speaker.
Yeah, now I'm going to call the next speaker up here, and Sue told me, well, you could just continue talking and spend 5 minutes. I'm not going to do that, because this is what is exciting about this Arctic Marine Pulse is Sue Moore has had the leadership on this for NOAA NIMS down in Seattle. The whole point of this model is to put some living meat around some of our static conceptual models that we have. And the whole idea is to combine the linking the contiguous domains, and this is focused now on the Pacific Arctic, and it leverages what is the Pacific Arctic data collections, but it's something that could go pan-Arctic if there's with engagement. And co-authors with Phyllis Stabenow and then Steve Okinen. So the outline of the talk, there are 4 pan-Arctic contiguous domains, and Eddie Carmack from DFO and Paul Wassman from Norway were part of these the development of those and the publications that came out from that. So the pulses model builds on a couple of more static type models that I'll talk about. It's to look at the seasonality of the phenology to coupling biology and physics in the Pacific Arctic, and it has a component to put in the human inclusive, the humans as part of the ecosystem approach. And they're currently another issue. There's one issue of deep sea research that came out, and the second is in revision, and this paper actually is been sent in for its with the revisions. So the whole concept is to take some existing models, pelagic-benthic coupling I'll show you, vective models, and put it into an integrative ecosystem assessment. So what what Eddie and Paul had in the 2006 paper were the 4 domains. And then what you see is it's focused on the Pacific here. That's what this talk is about, where we know we've got strong seasonality and we have interannual variability driven by dynamics upstream, bigger weather patterns, and then causing changes in flow, carbon input, biological impact, chemistry through Bering Strait. The second zone is the seasonal zone. This is where we have the phytoplankton blooms, right as the sea ice blooms. And then we have deposition before the zooplankton kick in to start grazing those. Because of the cold temperatures, you have a lot of coupling on the shallow shelf. It's only 30 to 50 meters deep. That then kick-starts a lot of the benthic processing, because it's very much of a benthic system. The third domain is this one on the margin and slope, where you see a long shelf transport, eddy formation that then connect the shelves into the basin as well as basin back to the shelf, and that it links this advective model that I'll briefly describe to you. And then there's the nearshore river domain, and these are all in that paper by Carmack and Wassman. And this is where you get the heating that's happening now and the freshwater input, and actually where you have that really tight connection with the local community users. And so an example in the U.S. side are these rivers that are coming into the Alaska coastal water. So how did they build the AMP? This is with the pelagic-benthic coupling model. Northern Bering and Chukchi Sea, we've had this one around for decades. The advective model, we put this together after a 2-year synthesis activity called the Pacific Arctic Marine Regional Synthesis of 11 PIs and a lot of 30 other ones to synthesize what do we know about this area and where do we go forward. And then the Arctic Pulse model is the dynamic one. It's looking at the seasonality and bringing that into those domains. So ice retreats, triggers phytoplankton bloom, you get this deposition. Ice retreats northward, you get the Bering Strait inflow. You get a late season retreat at the shelf slope, and that causes upwelling and wind-driven upwelling that occurs in that eddy formation I spoke about. And then you have these pulses of fresh water that come in from the coastal system. And this has an influence on the local production as well as where prey are aggregated in that nearshore system. So the pelagic-benthic coupling model, she says we have this as the past. You've got to remember these are conceptual. We still have pelagic-benthic coupling going on, but things are changing very quickly in this shallow shelf, and we're starting to see impacts. But the idea being dominated, early spring, most of the carbon goes to the bottom, benthic feeders, walruses, bearded seals, diving sea ducks. This is what we've known and iconic about this region. And then as you go into the summer, actually it becomes pelagic dominated. These guys are cooking away the benthic animals. It's stratified. But the idea is that in the future it'll be more warmer earlier, so the zooplankton will kick in, you'll graze down the chlorophyll more, less will go down to the bottom, it'll become more of a southern Bering Sea, for example, type. Potential for fisheries once that cold system that it now excludes those southern fisheries is no longer there. And this is just some of the data from our work that we do annually with our Canadians as part of the Canada's Free Ocean and the DBO. After working on this 2-year project, we put together an advected model. This is available for anybody to look at, executive summary, long report, all from soup to nuts, including human dimension. We had community meetings, 3 hub meetings that we got community input. But basically, this is just a schematic. Advection is the driver. Offshore, you have the nutrients, driving production, depending on the timing. Near shore, like I said, after spring bloom, you don't have much going. You have activities going on, but a lot of the primary production has declined. And so basically, there are a lot of processes, and what we tried to do is color code what the data said of where high value mass is, where low, that type of thing. But once again, you can talk your way through seasonality, but it doesn't have that embedded into it. So the Arctic pulses model was a way to try to conceptually incorporate these. So the river domain starts to kick off as sea ice pulls off. You have the Pacific water inflow. We have this pelagic-benthic coupling. It continues to go on now, and actually I have to admit that I told Sue we've moved this down. It actually starts in May in the south. It goes, and it's really cooking in July in the north. So this actually is more like an upside-down triangle. Oh, well, it's kind of a bulge here. But we actually have that in the south. It starts earlier. And then we have the seasonal ice domain is going on as it retreats. You have this production, pelagic-benthic coupling. Then the seasonal part of domain starts to retreat. So then you start in August and September, you have this upwelling. The ice is pulled back over the slope. You have wind effects. You have eddies going on. And we have this shelf break slope processes. And that's where we're starting to see increased production. That's also why the DBO 6, 7, and 8 were pushed more off to the outer shelf and slope, because that's where we're seeing pulses of biomass on like crab populations or fish populations. They're offshore because we have nearshore ice grounding and the impacts there. So there's a little bit of shift from latitudinal, then we go longitudinal. But that brings in the advection. So just the seasonal biophysics, so just to say, so there's the culmination. That's the seasonal construct of how you link those various models. So we have the seasonal biophysical pulses, and so why do you have that? Wind is a big driver. You have this steering of water just by sea level differences and larger atmospheric patterns that influence mainly northward flow of Pacific water. But depending on the winds and where you have this Aleutian low or the Aleutian, if it's sitting west of the where the Beaufort high is, you have changes in atmospheric patterns. Those changes, quite a variability that you're seeing that can influence the pulsing not only of water, but also of organisms and of that carbon. And so this process initiates this advective and the AMP model. So if you want to, what are some examples? How could we evaluate this? We have in the summer, there is a freshwater impulse through Bering Strait. It's been increasing. That's Rebecca Woodgate's paper where she has moorings. They're also seeing changes of increased pulsing around Icy Cape, which is in the northeastern part of the Chukchi. In the spring and early summer, we're seeing regional phytoplankton blooms. We've seen those for decades, actually, and river discharges pulse. But they're both pulsing. It doesn't bloom and bust around the Bering Strait. It blooms, it goes down, it comes back up, it goes down. So it's a real tied in with the physics. In the late summer, depending on the latitude, how much you're going to have pelagic-benthic coupling. Depends on, and that influences where those hot spots are. And then in the late summer, we're seeing in the fall and winter this advection, upwelling, and eddy pulses. So big deal on the slope areas of the northern Chukchi and into the Beaufort. And then you get into late fall and winter, you get this pulsing, that's just rapid cooling that happens as the sea ice starts to form again. And then you start ice cover right now comes down south of St. Lawrence Island by March. and then you start this process. So those are just some of the examples of the complexity actually of the timing of these pulses. So how do we, to close up here, the inclusion of the human component into the assessments? Humans are the apex of the Arctic food web, and have been relying on food as far as cultural identity. So what AMP is doing is looking at temporal events, and we're calling them pulses, but it brings in that linking that you have of seasonality into that. And as I will show you next, that relates directly to subsistence activities. So the idea of this AMP model is that to bring in a holistic assessment of the ecosystem, both the processes involved and the status and trends of that system. So if you look at conventional science versus local observations and development partnerships, just try to convey here's the AMP model. I've gone through it. You start in March from section. You're talking about, Western science now in June. These are the pulses that we're seeing. You go into September, ice minimum. December, storm-related upwelling still. And then the ice starts pulling back in. And then on the right is the calendar of local community use and the interpretations of that. And it's this connection that we want to build more into, or that needs to be included into an ecosystem assessment, the human environmental composition components. So this research partnerships have been going on. They have been successful. We've seen cases where they had a big impact on the subsistence counts and use. And these, for example, there's local community observers and samplers. So part of the traditional hunt exactly off of Barrow here. Then they are used for, scientists are able to be invited in to actually do some of the measurements. But this is the cultural heritage aspect of it. And they understand what are these animals eating, because they're a better sampler somewhat than our nets can do. And so that whole connection and feedback is a very important thing, and we're trying to figure out how we get this, the whaling, it's a keystone species, but a lot of what we spoke about yesterday, the scales, but how do you keep those, how do you get the feedbacks going? We look at feedbacks on natural science, and then we need to be able to get that cross-linkages between, particularly since the coastal zone is actually the least studied in a lot of what we do in science and the most connection to coastal communities. And there are programs being developed actually to start to address it on the pure science side, but they really can't go anywhere without having the built-in connections and workshop with the local community. So the two papers that came out in this special issue related to the partnerships that went on. One was to core use areas of, as you can see here, this is the density of bowhead locations, actually led by a composite of both local and natural scientists. The other example was looking at the body condition of the bowhead whale and the various parts. These papers were partnerships, and the co-authors are cross-linking those two aspects that I mentioned. So that's one of the parts of the pulse model that we really want to expand upon. So the next step, as I said, the paper, hopefully it got accepted. We'll know in about a week. It's the revisions. It expands on the temporal focus. What is the phenology? That's what we mean. What has happened? It doesn't happen just boom and bust. Like the carbon doesn't just go down straight where it's produced. It's usually downstream of that. So you need to know the timing. What are the parts of the puzzle there? We need to continue to explore the connections with the community-based observations, and we've had some discussions this week, and then continue on and have. Sue's been quite involved in that. And then, obviously, is this something that could go pan-Arctic? Is this something where we could look at the pulsing model in other Arctic regions, at least test it to see what works and what doesn't? So I want to thank BOEM was a financial support for working on this paper. We have multiple U.S. agencies that have been involved in the data collection. We plan to feed in, and it's one of the next step, the international data from the DBO into this pulse model to see, evaluate, and then actually to test some hypotheses. And once again, to thank the organizers.